Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to use my big lecture hall professor voice and do the best I can, but thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you all being willing to spend an hour of your evening to learn about what was, for me, a really special story. So I'm going to tell you a story about, I've been doing the history of the Appalachian Trail, I don't know, since 2015, something like that. My own personal history with it, and I say, by the way, I say Appalachian, even though I was born in a place where it's Appalachia, but I grew up in a place where it's Appalachia, so I can go back and forth between the two, it's no problem. But I've determined scientifically that the dividing line between those terms is Waynesboro. Once you get to Waynesboro and start heading north, more and more people say Appalachian. If you get to Waynesboro, you're driving south, you get to Waynesboro, by the time you get 20 miles south of Waynesboro, everybody says Appalachia. But by the time you cross the Potomac River, it's Appalachia. I grew up on, as I say, I grew up mostly in Northern Virginia, so for me it's the Appalachian Trail. And I started hiking on the Appalachian Trail in 1971. I was a brand new Boy Scout. And my scoutmaster, Mr. Ballard, was from California. He was a Marine. He had fought his way across the Pacific in the Second World War and was now stationed at the Pentagon, and he was volunteering as our scoutmaster. And he believed that Boy Scouts should be backpacking. None of this car camping for us. Forget that stuff. And, snowing, put on your woolies. The only thing that ever stopped us was ice storms. And today he would get arrested for some of the hikes we went on. But, he was a Marine who fought his way across the Pacific. So he took us hiking in Shenandoah on this trail that was called the Appalachian Trail. And if Mr. Ballard knew that trail went from Georgia to Maine, he never mentioned it. He was from California. Maybe he didn't know. I don't know. He just didn't mention. But in the same year that I joined the Boy Scouts, a man who lived in my neighborhood named Ed Garvey, he retired from the National Science Foundation, and then he hiked the whole trail, and then he wrote a book about it. Hiked the whole trail in 1 year, and he wrote a book about it, and it was the first book published about a through hike. It wasn't the first through hike by any stretch, but it was the first book published about a through hike. And because he lived around the corner from my scout house, he came and gave a talk about his hike. And I can still remember sitting there in this meeting house, watching him with the slides, like, real slides, showing his slides from Georgia to Maine and thinking, wait a minute, that trail that we hike on all the time, it goes all the way to Georgia, which is where most of my relatives were, all the way to Maine? Wow, that's amazing. And so the next time I got on the trail, I remember standing there and looking and thinking, okay, Maine, Georgia, and my response to it is very similar to the way an awful lot of people respond to the Appalachian Trail, which turns 100 next year. The Appalachian Trail Conference, the work began before 1925, but the Appalachian Trail Conference, which is now the Conservancy, was founded in 1925. So the celebration is going to be this coming year. So that's all background. I was working on a history of the trail, and just to show you, just in case you don't know, there it is, that bright red line. So this year it's 2,195 point something. It changes a little bit every year, just a little bit. The story I'm going to tell is a little different from that. This is the part of the trail that we're going to be talking about tonight, and that's the stretch from the Peaks of Otter down to Damascus. This map gives you an idea of what I want to talk about, because on this map, the blue line is the current route of the trail. The blue line is the current route of the trail. And the red line is the part that I call the Lost Appalachian Trail. And that's a 300-mile difference. It's more than 50 miles at its widest point between those two segments of the trail. And in the original routing of the trail, the red line, which on this side of the New River is largely the route of the Blue Ridge Parkway, that was some of the most beautiful parts of the whole trail. And you'll see when I continue a little bit what happened. So I'm a historian. Historians, we spend a lot of time in archives. And archives are very dangerous places for historians. Because you go into the archive, you have a plan. See, I can see you nodding along there. You go into the archive, you have a plan. you have so many hours today to work on this, and so you go to the you get the archivist brings you out the boxes you need, and you start going through the stuff, and you're just making notes and taking pictures, and it's all going great. And then all of a sudden, something just pops up in front of you, and you're just like Alice when the rabbit runs past her because he's late. This rabbit hole opens up in front of you. It is your professional obligation as a historian to walk up to that rabbit hole, look down in there, and ask yourself, what the heck's down there? And is it more interesting than what I'm doing right now? And I tell my students all the time, you have to look. So this particular document popped up in front of me, and I stood there staring down into that rabbit hole for a while, because in this letter from 1929, Myron Avery, who was about to become the chairman of the Appalachian Trail Conference, and in many ways is the person who made the Appalachian Trail a reality, didn't propose it, but he did, sort of marshaled the troops and got it done. He was writing about Southern Virginia, and he described it as our terra incognita. Now, Myron Avery was from Lubec, Maine, which is as far to the east as you can be in the United States and still be in the United States. From the docks in Lubec, you look across the St. John River, and that's Canada. New England bends around like that, so it's very far east. So he was also himself personally from a very long way away. But he didn't know anything about Southern Virginia, and he didn't know anyone from Southern Virginia, and the most recent good map of this region had been made by an engineer in the Confederate Army. The Geological Survey had done one map of what today is called the Galax Triangle, but Galax wasn't on that map because it was in 1901, and Galax was founded in 1911, I think. But so Galax hadn't even been founded yet. So it really was kind of a terra incognita, and Avery was really, really worried about how to route the trail from the Peaks of Otter to Damascus, because they had figured out all the rest of the route. They knew the Appalachian Trail Conference folks had figured out more or less exactly where the trail was going to go, except for this stretch between the Peaks of Otter and Damascus. And they were just lost. And then something happened that really upset Myron Avery, because if you know anything about Myron Avery, I'll just say calling him a control freak was being nice. Because he was a control freak. He was the kind of control freak that if he saw a control freak, he would say, now that's a control freak. I mean, he wanted to be in charge of every tiny little minute detail of the trail. And shortly after, the next letter in the file after this one was from this guy in the foreground. His name's Shirley Cole, from Kelly's Knob, just outside of Copper Hill, which is down in Floyd County. And he was a graduate not of Virginia Tech, but of the Virginia Tech. They had a special program for adult farmers to get like a one-year certificate in agricultural management. And so he graduated from that, and he was the first county agent in Floyd County. This is when the extension program was just getting started. And he had heard about the Appalachian Trail, and he got all excited about it, and he realized there's no route for the trail where I live here in Floyd County, or Patrick County, or Carroll County, or anywhere down in southern Virginia there. And he said, so I'll figure it out. And so he and a friend hiked for weeks and weeks, and they figured out a good route for the trail, and they wrote to the Appalachian Trail Conference and said, we have solved the problem of Southern Virginia. Here's the route. Myron Avery had a freak out. And he wrote to one of his trail scouts, the guy in the sort of cowboy hat, whose name was Roy Osmer. I love this photo because the guy standing next to him is also, they're both foresters in the Georgia Forest Service. And you can see this guy's got a Colt 45 stuck in his belt. So Osmer was one of the trail scouts for the Appalachian Trail. He scouted the route in Georgia. He scouted some of the route in Tennessee. And Avery trusted him. And he wrote to Osmer right away, and he said, Roy, I need you to come to Virginia. We can't let, and he actually used this phrase, those people decide where our trail is going to go. So I need you to get up there into Floyd County, go to Roanoke, or actually go to Peaks of Otter, go to the Peaks of Otter Lodge, no longer there, but you can see the historic marker, and start from there and find a route to Damascus. And Osmer was like, I'm on it. I'm on it. I'll be there right away. Apparently in the Georgia Forest Service in the 1920s, you could just like drop everything and go help some private endeavor, because it was truly a private endeavor in those days. You know, it didn't become a national park until 1968, so you could just drop everything and go up to Virginia and do that kind of stuff. And he asked Avery, can you send me your measuring wheel? Myron Avery, almost every photo you see of Myron Avery, he's got his measuring wheel with him. He loved that measuring wheel. And you can see it. It's in the Appalachian Trail Museum in Pine Grove Furnace, Pennsylvania. I had to go and sort of bow to the measuring wheel. And he said, can I have your measuring wheel? And Avery said, no. That's mine. I'll arrange for another one. So Osmer does that. He goes to the Peaks of Otter Lodge. Somebody arranged to get him a measuring wheel. And he starts off trying to figure out a route. And he was a very experienced trail scout. He'd done a lot of it. And he was a forester. He knew his way around the woods. And he got lost. And if you've ever been to Floyd County and you've driven the Blue Ridge Parkway from Roanoke down to like where the Blue Ridge Music Center is in Patrick County near the North Carolina border, you cross one stream after another and one wind gap after another, and so it's down and up and down and up and down. The parkway, of course, has bridges, but if you were walking it was like this, and he just got lost. And that great escarpment of Southwest Virginia, which the Cherokee called the Great Blue Wall. If you've been, it's really fun to drive down Adney Gap Road. Don't do it unless you have four-wheel drive and are okay backing up a half a mile if somebody's coming up. So, because people coming up have the right of way. And so it's a really rough geography, and Osmer got lost. So he did the thing he wasn't supposed to do. He went into the town of Floyd and he looked up Shirley Cole. And he said, Mr. Cole, can you please help me? And Cole said, have I got a route for you? And so they spent 2 weeks together scouting the trail from Peaks of Otter all the way to the New River, just near Galax. And then Osmer wrote this 11-page report, single-spaced, sent it back to Myron Avery. I've solved the problem of Southwest Virginia. Here's where the trail ought to go. And literally the last sentence of that 11-page report says, and Mr. Shirley Cole of Floyd, Virginia was extraordinarily helpful to me in this endeavor. And so Avery, being Avery, then takes full credit, he writes to the board, we've solved the problem of Southern Virginia. So they routed the trail in that red line that I showed you before. But a lot of it looked like this. Old roads. And not just there. When the Appalachian Trail was declared complete in 1937, more than half of the trail looked like that. Roads. It was half road walk. This is actually part of the route of the Appalachian Trail in Patrick County. It's actually called Appalachian Trail Lane. And although people who live there don't know that there's a reason why it's called that. And you can also see it's kind of foggy. If you've driven from Whitfield down to Charlotte on the interstate there and gone down through Fancy Gap, where they have all the big fog warning signs and everything, Fancy Gap, before it was Fancy Gap, was known as Foggy Camp. For a very good reason. It's one of the foggiest places I've ever been. I spent a lot of time in the Fancy Gap area. It's foggy. And so this is really what a lot of the trail looked like. And so the first trail guides relied on things like this. Little tiny wooden churches, little tiny schools, little tiny stores. And the trail guide would say, go down such and such a road for 2.5 miles. When you reach the County Line Baptist Church, which is what this one is, when you reach County Line Baptist Church, turn left. Go another 1.5 miles. When you reach such and such, there used to be a school there. It's fallen down, but you can see the remnants of it. And then turn right, and so those are the kinds of directions that hikers had to follow. Sometimes you came to places like this. This is the Edwardsville store on the Crooked Road. You can see I took this photo in 2020. The Edwardsville store needs a little love. It's not open, but somebody's gotten support pillars under the upstairs deck there, and hopefully they're renovating it. But this was one of the places you would have stopped to buy supplies when you were hiking. Because you couldn't go to REI, you couldn't go to places like that. You had to stop at these little country stores. The geography of Southern Virginia is amazing. And that escarpment is amazing, but the most amazing part is the Dan River Gorge at the headwaters of the Dan. This is the Pinnacles of Dan. I've never been sure why it's pinnacles plural, because there's just one. But it looks like, as you can see, it's like a pyramidical mountain down in the gorge. And they routed the trail up one side and down the other. and I talked to several of the earliest long-distance hikers on the trail described this as the second most difficult part of the whole trail. Mahoosuc Notch always wins as the most difficult, but this was the second most difficult. And I talked to Gene Espy, who was the second person to through hike the trail. Gene just turned 99. He survived 2 bouts of COVID, not one, both in his 90s. You know, he is a tough man. And I interviewed him in 2019, and I said, Gene, do you remember hiking over the pinnacle to that? Oh, yeah. Well, what was it like? He said, I think I fell the whole way down. So you know, the pinnacles were just amazing. You can still hike it, but you have to get a permit from the power company that owns the town's dam there. You can get the permit, and they don't let people go by themselves anymore because somebody fell and broke his leg pretty badly a few years ago, and they had to helicopter him out, and it was not good. So now the power company requires 2 people to go, but you can do it. The Great Falls of Dan, just really spectacular waterfalls. Some of these are submerged now in the lakes from the power supply. But there was only one trail shelter in the entire 300-mile stretch of that section of trail. It was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. If you know anything about CCC construction, you can imagine that this was built by the CCC because they love stone and cement. They love stone and cement. And this trail shelter is still there. I took that photo just a couple of years ago. And I'll tell you how to get there. So you get on the Blue Ridge Parkway. It's really easy. Get on the Blue Ridge Parkway from Roanoke, and you start driving south, and you come to a turnout with an absolutely beautiful view, and it's called the Saddle. And you pull into the Saddle. The view out over the Piedmont is spectacular. And when you're standing there, looking out at the view, you see a little trail going up the side of the hill there, and that's the old Appalachian Trail. There's no marker to tell you that, but it is. I talked to the National Park Service about getting a marker. I don't have that kind of time. but maybe since I'm going to retire soon, maybe someday I'll fight that fight. But that's the old Appalachian Trail, and it's just about a 1/4 mile up to that shelter. It's a really easy hike, and very easy. Anybody in this room could do it. It's really, and it's graveled most of the way up. It's pretty easy to get to. But this shelter would not be allowed today. Absolutely not allowed today, because maybe you can tell from this photograph, it has a side door and a front door. And if you woke up in the middle of the night, if you went out the front door, first step, no problem. Second step, no problem. Third step would be about 600 feet straight down. The National Park Service would absolutely not permit this today, trust me. So, but in the 1930s, the CCC crew was like, perfect place for a shelter. We'll just put it right there on the edge. So there it is. But it's a great place to go for a picnic, I'll tell you. But a lot of hikers, because there were no shelters, hikers had to depend on people in the community. If they didn't want to camp, and they wanted to stay indoors, they had to depend on people in the community. And so the old trail guides listed the names and phone numbers, just 5-digit numbers, of people in the community who would take hikers in. And one of the people who would do that was a woman named Erna Webb. And Erna lived in this house, which is the largest home in Carroll County. And it's known as the Sidna Allen house. Does anybody recognize the name Sidna Allen? Why?
I grew up in Fancy Gap.
So what? So tell us why Sidna Allen is famous?
It's the courthouse shootings in the early 1900s when they tried to try Sidney Allen.
Yeah. So the Allen brothers were prominent moonshiners in Carroll County, and one of them got arrested. Sidna's brother got arrested. The short version of the story is then in court, there was a courthouse shooting, and most of the government of Carroll County perished in that shooting. Oh, goodness. Because it was a very small government, and so the judge died, the prosecuting attorney died, like the county attorney died, the sheriff died, one of the sheriff's deputies died, a whole bunch of, there were 50 some odd shots fired, and so Sidna went on the lam. He got away. Floyd, his brother, did not, the one who was on trial. But Sidna got away. They ran him down in, I think, in Iowa. And so this was his home. And so it was seized by the court to help pay his legal fees. And so his lawyer got it, and his lawyer then sold it to the Webb family. And so Erna, by the time the Appalachian Trail came by, both her son and husband had both passed. And so she was taking in boarders because she had a lot of room, as you can see. It's a big house. It's being renovated now. I think the renovations are probably pretty much done, and it's turned into a museum. I'm going to be down there in a couple weeks, and I'll know for sure. But can you imagine you're an AT hiker, and for $1.50, Erna Webb would take you in. She'd feed you dinner, hot shower, breakfast, and it's family-style dinner. What are the odds that she did not tell you about the courthouse shooting? What are the odds? I mean, it was the biggest thing. Would you agree it's the biggest thing to happen there?
The biggest thing in Carroll County for half a century at least.
Yeah. So, just huge news, right? And it was still relatively recent news also. So, of course, they would have heard about it. Or you could have stayed in Galax, in downtown Galax, in the Bluemont Hotel. You can't stay there now. It burned in the late 50s. But this Earl Schaefer, who was the first person to hike the trail from one end to the other, this is where he stayed when he passed through Galax. Or you could stay in fire towers. Or if the fire tower keeper would allow it. Some would, some wouldn't. This one was near Conarup, and almost all those fire towers are gone today. So this is another place that people would stay. On the west side of the New River, the trail got up onto Iron Mountain and took Iron Mountain all the way down to Damascus. And you can hike that whole stretch of the old trail today. It's just called the Iron Mountain Trail. It's a multi-use trail, horses, mountain bikers, stuff, but I've hiked a good bit of it. It's really, really pretty. So this is the view from Skulls Gap, and the Grayson Highlands are in the far distance. It's really, really beautiful geography. And then eventually you got to Damascus. This is a photo from the 1940s and of the old train station in Damascus. And so that was the whole stretch of the trail. So from 1930 to 1952, this is where the Appalachian Trail went. And then in 1952, they declared that section of the trail closed, and that it would now be the route that it takes today through the Jefferson National Forest. And they moved it for two reasons. One, if they moved it into Jefferson National Forest, then it would be off the roads and into the forest. So it would be a better trail. And the second is, it would have federal protection. The Jefferson National Forest had expanded dramatically during the Depression because so many people had abandoned their farms. The government was able to buy up a lot of that land very inexpensively. So federal land was available. And then there was one other problem, and that is that the Appalachian Trail was and is maintained entirely by volunteer clubs. It's the only national park of any size maintained entirely by volunteers. And today there's 33 of those clubs. And so they couldn't get a club to stick in Southern Virginia. First of all, Galax is the only town of any size, and in the 1930s it only had a couple of thousand people living in it, and most of them worked in furniture or mirror factories, and so didn't have the time to go spend building a trail, keeping a trail up. So they had a really hard time keeping a trail club going. So for all of those reasons, they moved it in 1952, and they told the people who had been in charge of it to go and take down all the signs, because they used to use diamond-shaped metal markers on the trail, pull down all those signs. And one of the people I interviewed told me, and I'll talk about him in just a minute, his grandfather who raised him was so angry about this that he built a big bonfire out by his barn, and he threw all those metal signs in. Because he had devoted 2 decades to building and taking care of the trail, and then one day folks in Washington just said, okay, that's over. He was really, really mad. So when I started working on this project, I did the archival work and I learned some things about it, but I decided if I'm going to really make sense of this, I have to go. And so I got in my car, I did the obvious thing, I got in my car and I drove down to Floyd, and I drove to Hillsville in Carroll County, I drove to Patrick County, I just drove all over and I just talked to people. I went into stores, like there's an antique store in Fancy Gap right across from the diner there, and the Lakeview Diner, which, did you ever see a lake when you were growing up there?
Well, there was a
pond. It was kind of a big claim to call it the Lakeview. So, but anyway, there's an antique store there, and I went in the antique store, and the guy who owned the antique store said, "Do you know the Appalachian Trail used to go right past your door?" He said, "I had no idea." So, of course he had no idea, because he's only in his 50s. So it had been gone for a very long time by the time he was even born. But the more I talked to people, the more people came out of the woodwork to talk to me, to tell me the trail used to go across my father's farm, or my grandfather's farm, or my grandmother used to tell me stories about the old Appalachian Trail. And so I'm just going to tell you about 3 of those people. This is Doug Bell, and I gave a talk like this at the Floyd Public Library and in 2019. And Doug came up to me afterwards and he said, "The trail used to go across my grandfather's farm. If you have time, I'll show you." And so the next day, of course I had time. The next day, I went with Doug and I took this photo. He was standing in front of the ruins of his grandfather's house where he was raised. And Doug doesn't remember the trail because he was born in 1954 and it moved away in 1952. But his grandfather talked about it nonstop. And he showed me this photo, and that white structure is where Doug was standing. So he's standing there in front of the remnants of that white structure, which was his grandfather's home. It was hit by lightning in the 1970s and burned. But the trail used to, if you look at this photo, the trail used to kind of come down the hill here and go off to the right. His grandfather moved the trail markers. So that it came up here between the chicken house and the woodshed and went right past his front door. And so Doug asked his grandfather once, why'd you do that? And he said, well, the hikers, they're from all over. And I wanted him to knock on the door so we could chat. And he would feed them or sell them some eggs or some milk or something. And so this cultural exchange occurred between a farmer who had grown up there in Floyd County and probably had left the county a few times in his life, but he was too busy. He was a farmer. And so hikers from places like Naugatuck, Connecticut, and Cordell, Georgia, and York, Pennsylvania, would come by and knock on his door, and they would talk, and they would tell about their lives, and he would tell them about his life. And so this really wonderful cultural exchange occurred between the hikers and the people who lived there. When I started working on this project, so many people said to me, you need to talk to Ralph Barnard. You need to talk to Ralph Barnard. And then they would say, but Ralph is, well, he's a little crusty, or difficult. So I kept putting off talking to Ralph Barnard because I was a little nervous about it. And they would say, the trail used to, his grandfather was the one who threw the trail markers in the fire. His grandfather took care of the whole trail in Patrick County. It's about 20 miles of trail. He's the one who rooted it up and over the pinnacles of Dan. And so, so I was a little nervous about it, but I thought, okay, I have to talk to Ralph. So I got his phone number and I called him, and he answered the phone, and I said, hello, Mr. Barnard, my name is Mills Kelly, click. Called back, Mr. Barnard, this is Professor Mills Kelly, I am not, click, a telemarketer, and he wouldn't take my call. So I got desperate, I resorted to desperate measures. I wrote him a letter, signed it myself, real old school, a letter with a stamp and all those things. My kids think this is hilarious because they're in their 20s, and who writes letters in their 20s? But so as soon as I sent that letter, like 4 days later, he called me. I'm so sorry I hung up on you. I thought you were one of those damn telemarketers, And why wouldn't he think that, right? I didn't have a local exchange. I had a Northern Virginia exchange. So anyway, he said, next time you're down here, you just stop on by. So this is Ralph and his lovely wife, Hope. And I went to their house, and I hung out with them. And Ralph is the sweetest man I know. I don't know why anyone said he was difficult. He really is truly one of the sweetest people I've ever met in my life. Maybe he's just mean to his neighbors. I don't know. But no, he really is. And Ralph's now 86. I think I have to go see him when I'm down there in 3 weeks. And he pulled out a shoebox full of photographs of the old trail that no historian has ever seen until that minute. Like this one. This is members of the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club coming down to work on the trail in 1940. And the house in the background there, that wood frame house, same house that he's standing in front of here, Ralph was a brick mason. So that's the house he grew up in, and then he bricked it up after his grandfather died and turned it into a brick home. His daughter lives there now. He lives in the trailer next door. No extra credit if you can pick out Myron Avery in this photograph. But nobody had ever seen this photo. The book, I've got a bunch of photos in the book that Ralph let me use, and just from his archive, which was a shoebox in the closet, right? But so John Barnard, his grandfather, was actually made famous by the National Geographic magazine because they wrote a story about the Appalachian Trail in 1948. And the writer stayed at the Barnard family farm And he wrote this lyrical description of sitting on the Barnard's front porch while Mr. Barnard was finishing up his chores in the barn. He was sitting on the front porch, and a thunderstorm blew through, and the lilies were blooming, and the hydrangeas were blooming, and the swallows were flying around, eating the bugs off the grass. And I'd read that, and I was waiting for Ralph to get those photos, and I was sitting on the front porch, and a thunderstorm had just blown through, and the flowers were blooming, and the swallows were flying around, and I got goosebumps. I just got goosebumps there. And so, because I was like living in this National Geographic story, it was just really amazing. And if you know anyone who hiked, and the name of any hiker who hiked the Appalachian Trail, you know the name Grandma Gatewood. See, everybody knows Emma Gatewood. And so, if they know anything about names of long-distance hikers, Emma Gatewood read this story many years later because, she had the stack of National Geographic magazines in her house because it was a federal offense to throw away your National Geographic magazine. And so she was just like reading through, and she read this story about the Appalachian Trail, and then told her daughter, and Emma was 67, she told her daughter, "I'm going to go take a hike." And her daughter said, "Sounds good." First time she failed. The next year, she didn't do well the first time. She had to try again the next year. But the next year, she hiked the whole Appalachian Trail and became not the first woman to hike the whole Appalachian Trail. She became the third woman to hike the whole Appalachian Trail. She was the first one to hike it by herself. A previous woman named Mildred Norman, several years earlier, had hiked with her boyfriend in 1952. Imagine the scandal. Hiked with her boyfriend, and they had a system though. They would meet people, and her boyfriend would walk up to people and say, "Hi, my name is," say his name, I just blanked on his name, "and this is Millie." Yeah. And just let people assume that they were married. They weren't married. And she, after hiking the trail, she had a kind of a mystical revelation during the trail, and she changed her name to Peace Pilgrim and spent the rest of her life hiking North America promoting nuclear disarmament. She hiked 28,000 miles over the next 25 years. Lived like a Buddhist monk. Pardon?
What happened to boyfriend? Yeah.
She dumped him. Buddhist monks don't have boyfriends. So anyway, Emma Gatewood, she read this story, and that's what inspired her. And then the last people I'm going to tell you about are the Dixons, the Dixon family. This is Dixon's Ferry Bridge over the New River. It's a little bit north of Galax, a little downstream from Galax because the New flows north there. And it's named for the Dixon family who used to run a ferry there. That's why it's Dixon's Ferry Bridge. And if you wanted to get across the New River on the Appalachian Trail in the 1930s or the 1940s or the first 2 years of the 1950s, if you were going south, you walked up to the Dixon's house and you knocked on the door, and Mr. and Mrs. Dixon would put you across for a nickel. If you were hiking the other way, coming north, you had to stand on the far side of the New River and shout. And if you've been to the New River in Southern Virginia, you know that this is a very wide river. It's not so apparent from this photograph, but it's a very, very wide river. So when I talked to Gene Espy, and I said, because he did that, and I said, "Gene, how long did it take you to get someone's attention from the Dixon's house?" And he said, "It was a long time." And so I interviewed Sally Dixon Rakes, who's now in her early 80s, who she remembers the hikers. And I said, "Did your father ever consider putting a bell on the other side of the river?" And she thought about it for a minute, and she said, "That would have been a really good idea." Really good idea. So I want you to just visualize a river ferry for a minute, because it costs you 5 cents to get across. River ferry, get it firmly in your mind. There's the ferry. That's Redbird, their ferry, and that's Sally's father in the background and her grandfather in the foreground. And again, photo that nobody's seen before because it was in a shoebox in Sally's house. And so that's how you got across the New River back in those days. Here's the best part of the whole Dixon family story, well, the two best parts. The first is, so Gene Espy told me that when the Dixons finally came and got him, it was Mrs. Dixon that came and got him, and she brought him across the river and sat him on the front porch and gave him some iced tea, and he was sitting there, and there was this little girl behind the screen door, a little tiny girl, and Gene loves children, and he'd been hiking for a month at this point, and he wanted to talk to this little girl. He was hiking by himself, he kind of bored. Wanted to talk to this little girl, but she wouldn't come out. That was Sally. And I asked her, do you remember Mr. Espy? She said, oh, I absolutely remember Mr. Espy because he sent us a Christmas card every year for 20 years. That's Jean. And she said, and it always had, news about him and his family and all that. So I remember him really well. And I said, so Sally, why wouldn't you come out when he... And she said, well, he had a beard. And I said, well, why was that a problem? She said, well, my father had always told me to stay away from men with beards. Because they were either hobos or communists. And in 1951, you can imagine how that would have been like in her mind, right? So she didn't meet him at the time, but she remembers his Christmas cards. But also, I've become friends with all these folks. I've become really good friends with all these folks, and the Dixons in particular. I've been to their family reunion now 3 times. And so when I wrote the book for them. I did not write this book for my colleagues in the history department. I wrote the book for Ralph and for Griggs and Sally. I wrote it for those folks. And so I wanted to tell their story. And so that's what this book is about. And so I'm just going to read you the last part of the last little bit, just to give you a sense, because like I write those other books too, with lots of footnotes and all that stuff. Makes my colleagues very, very happy. But I also write like this. So the Appalachian Trail left its original route in southwestern Virginia at the end of the 1952 hiking season and quickly passed out of the knowledge of the vast majority of the Appalachian Trail community. Because it was written out of the trail guides, hikers passing north and south in ever-growing numbers had no way to learn that they were missing out on the pinnacles of Dan, the climb up Farmer Mountain with its 360-degree views of the New River Valley, or the opportunity to see the second highest waterfall in Virginia up on Bent Mountain. But the trail left many traces on the landscape of this region, some of which are still easily read today. The Galax chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution is the Appalachian Trail chapter, although the current local DAR leaders aren't sure why. I asked, they didn't know. Several roads still bear the name Appalachian Trail, and if you know where to look, you can find rusty old Appalachian Trail markers on trees, likely put there by Shirley Cole and Myron Avery back in 1931. Those are the tangible things. The intangible things are just as important. All of us have a place where we feel the most connected, the most comfortable, the place where we know the way things smell, how the wind blows, how people talk, and what everyone is eating. Even in this seemingly rootless world where jet planes shuttle millions through the air every day, where people move with increasing frequency in search of jobs, of water, of security, to get away from war, fire, or famine, most humans are still rooted in their places, the places that they've named, the places that they know best. In the South, that place isn't just a place, it's a home place. And home places are endowed with even greater significance than ordinary locations. Every home place, wherever it is, has its own stories. And these are stories that people told me when I was driving around and talking to them over the years. Over there, that's where lightning hit that tree. Right there, that's where we first met. Up there on the mountain, that's where those folks were lost for 3 days. And you can see down there where the river bends, that's where our neighbor's son found a dead bear. I heard about the dead bear from 2 different people. Places become a code, a shorthand for stories that define who we are, who we've been, and who we'll be. Physical geography, buildings, soundscapes, smells, they provide the boundaries and the parameters for memory, for understanding, for teaching, and most of all, for belonging. But just as important as those physical things, if not more so, are the stories. The stories of the Dixon family members tell about poling hikers across the river in Redbird. Ralph Barnard's tales of hikers and their fear of panthers, and the hope that Richard Farmer still holds out for the town of Fries. He was the mayor of Fries when I talked to him. Dorothy Shiflett's stories of building trail with her father, and the pride in Doug Bell's voice when he speaks of how the Appalachian Trail came to his grandfather's front door. In a part of America where the past really matters, the Appalachian Trail lives on, inscribed on the inner landscapes of the people who still remember and are determined not to forget. In this Appalachian heartland, where people's lives are organized around stories of the past and how that past is inextricably woven into their present and their future, memories of the Appalachian Trail and their place in its history remain an important way that they make sense of their world. They wish other people remembered it the way they do, but in the end, all that really matters is that they remember the old trail. Thank you. And I'll just say, well, I do have a podcast about the history of the Appalachian Trail, the Green Tunnel podcast. It's on every single podcast app known to humans, including YouTube. And it's we finished the show. We finished it up in the spring, 51 episodes, and so far 200,000 downloads. So we're pretty happy about that. And so you can hear Ralph, and you can hear Sally, and you can hear Doug in the episode that we have about this part of the story. So you can hear their actual voices. So thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
So has anybody considered putting some kind of markers along this?
You mean anybody besides me?
Yeah.
So, yes. In fact, there's a bicycle touring group in Floyd County. Every year they do the Tour de Floyd. And it starts at I can never remember, there are two wineries in Floyd County, one at the north end, one at the south end, and they go from one to the other. And one of them is Villa Appalachia, and the other something with an M, I can't remember. And Chateau Morissette, thank you. And so somebody's been there. So they're really interested in that. And so they've been starting to talk to the Park Service, because a lot of it's along the Blue Ridge Parkway, so that invokes the National Park Service.
Right.
A lot of it on the west side of the river, it's in the Jefferson National Forest, and so that's now the U.S. Forest Service. So there's a lot of dealing with federal rules, but they're talking about it. At a minimum, I want one on the saddle turnout there where you can see the trail.
Yeah.
So, but like I said, I don't have that kind of time. Yes, ma'am.
How much of the Appalachian Trail is privately owned?
So,
The land?
that's a wonderful question, was how much of the trail is on private land, and the answer today is around 1%. And that land is all kind of, the National Park Service has right of first refusal over the purchase of that land, so anytime it goes up for sale, the federal government's going to buy it. So it was a private project, and when the trail was declared completed in 1937, about 800 of the 2,000 miles was on federal land, federal or state land. So 1,200 miles was on private land. The trail became a national park in 1968, and Congress, in its typical wisdom, appropriated about $2 million to acquire 1,200 miles worth of real estate. That bought about 20 miles worth of real estate, you know. So it wasn't until the Clinton administration that Congress finally started appropriating enough money to buy up land, and most of that land was purchased through a congenial process. Most. About 100 lawsuits got filed for eminent domain, and if you know anything about the history of eminent domain, the federal government wins 100% of those cases. The framers of the Constitution were very clear that this was a right that the government should have. And so the U.S. government always wins. But the vast majority, and I've examined a lot of these cases, and the vast majority of those cases, people who had been granting easements for the trail for a generation or two said, oh sure, I'd be happy to sell that to you. I love the Appalachian Trail, that'd be great. You know, as long as I can still, you know, access the other half of my property, that's fine. And, you know, there were a few bitter lawsuits, a few, but almost none. Yes?
When you talked about the most difficult section of the Appalachian Trail, my perspective is a little different in saying that the Hoosick Notch is not the most difficult. It's the slowest 1 mile on the Appalachian Trail, because it's more like it's a challenge to get through all the nooks and crannies and everything. But some of the presidential ranges are more difficult, in my opinion, in terms of a hike.
Yeah, the people who built the trails in the settler people who built the white trails or the trails in the White Mountains, they were really modeled on European trails. And if you've hiked in the mountains of Europe, they don't believe in switchbacks. What's the shortest distance between the bottom of the mountain and the top of the mountain? Okay, that's how we'll route the trail. In Romania, they don't have ski lifts. You ski down to the bottom, you put your skis on your back, take off your ski boots, put on your hiking boots, hike back up to the top, ski down again. And they wonder why more people don't come to ski. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any connection between where the AP was and where the New River Trail State Park is now?
There is a little bit, yeah. So the New River Trail State Park, from the Dixon's farm you look across at the New River Trail. It's because it's the old rail line that went from Fries to Pulaski. And because there was this huge factory, the Washington Mill in Fries, which, you know, at Virginia Tech, it's the Pamplin School of Business. Mr. Pamplin was a rich person in Chicago. He bought that mill and then closed it for a tax advantage and put about 1,200 people out of work in the process. He's not a popular guy in Fries. So the mill closed in the 80s, and then they pulled up the railroad tracks and they put the New River Trail in there. But the Appalachian Trail, when you went across from the Dixons, just downstream a little bit from the bridge I showed you, then you walked along that railroad track until you got to Billsby Dam, which is, I don't know, 6 miles, something like that. And then you turned and went up onto Farmer Mountain from there. So there's about 6 miles. If you're on the New River Trail from Billsby Dam to Fries, you're on the old Appalachian Trail. Yes?
If you try to retrace that route now, can you do it without trespassing?
Yes, you can, most of it. Most of it.
Most of it?
Most of it. And the thing is, in that part of the state, people don't care. They just don't. I mean, if you walk across somebody's farm, as long as you're just walking across, no, I mean, I've done it. Nobody's yelled at me. They say, hey, how you doing? And I go over and talk to them, and we chat for a little bit, and I tell them I'm, you know, looking for the old route of the apple. Somebody told me I used to come across the farm here. You know, I bought the farm 20 years ago, but, you know, so it's just basically fine. And you don't see a lot of no trespassing signs in Floyd County.
So back in the late 60s and early 70s, the two places on the trail that were known to be the most wild was Maine and Southwest Virginia. So this would have been after this got routed, but nonetheless, Southwest Virginia.
Yep, and Maine continues to be very wild. The Southwest Virginia stretch of the trail is not as wild as it used to be. Not as wild. So, heavily used. Heavily used. Yes, ma'am.
This is a little bit, you know, not the focus of this talk, but whose brainstorm?
Whose idea was the Appalachian Trail? It was the idea came from a guy named Benton Mackay. He was from Western Massachusetts. He was a regional planner, did a lot of work with the TVA, and he was an expert in watershed management. And it's a long story how he came up with it, but he'd had a personal tragedy. His wife died in 1921, and he was really broken by her death. And a friend of his invited him to stay at this guy's estate in the Hudson Valley, and that guy happened to be the editor of the Journal of the American Institute of Architects. And so he talked to Benton in his grief and said, you know, what are you working on? And Mackay said, well, I had this idea for this long-distance hiking trail that would go from Mount Mitchell in North Carolina, the highest point in the southeast, to Mount Washington in New Hampshire, the highest point in the northeast. So this editor encouraged him to write it up, and he did, and fortunately then the editor edited it, because I read the original draft, it was horrible, almost unreadable, and Mackay was an idea guy, but not necessarily a very good writer. And so it got published in the Journal of the American Institute of Architects, of all places, in 1921, but it was one of those things that landed at exactly the right moment, because hiking as a pastime had really taken off just before the First World War, and hiking clubs had begun forming, and they were excited. They'd done hiking, and they wanted more trails. And so then this just grandiose idea comes along to build a 2,000-mile long trail, and people said, what a great idea, let's do it. Now, Mackay was very happy that other people did it. He was not a get things done guy, he was an idea guy. But I'll say, he was a socialist, and a Harvard socialist, and by that I mean it was like an intellectual thing for him. He didn't spend a lot of time with workers, but his idea was that, and he was, now in 1921, the First World War just ended, that was a disaster. The influenza pandemic had just ended, that was an even bigger disaster. You know, more than 1 million people in the United States died during the pandemic, and industrial labor was dangerous, and Mackay wanted the workers to have a place to go and get some fresh air, because it would be good for them. And he was right. Fresh air is good for all of us. Being in the mountains, in the tree, under the trees is good for all of us. We call it nature therapy today, or forest bathing. I like that term from Japan. So he was right about that. What he wasn't right about was that working class people would want to go up into the mountains and build a hiking trail. Because working class people on their 1 day a week off, because they worked 6 days a week in those days, what did they want to do? They wanted to sleep They wanted to go to a baseball game. They wanted to go to the pub and drink some beer. They wanted to just hang out with their families. They didn't want to go do that. Middle class people, on the other hand, had leisure time, and they had cars. So they could get to the mountains more easily, and they had time to go build this trail, which is what they did. So it became really a middle class playground, not a working class place. But Mackay was okay with that, because his big thing happened. So that's where. And that's why it's so close to all the big cities of the East Coast, because he wanted the workers to be able to get there easily, which meant training for them. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up. Thank you all very, very much for being here.